behind each barrel was a separate striker, the breech being fed with paper cartridges containing a .58 caliber round and powder, enveloped in small steel tubes with percussion caps on their ends. A quantity of these cartridges was fed into the gun from a hopper on top of the breech block. A turn of a handle at the rear of the assembly drove a mechanism that assured firing would continue for as long as the ammunition held out. It was beautifully simple, yet deadly. Nothing like it had existed before.
When any weapon operates, the gun essentially goes through 7 cycles. It feeds a round, which would come out of the magazine. It feeds a round in, chambers the round. The chamber is located right here. It locks the round, which is represented by closing this bolt. It fires the round by one means or another. It unlocks the round, it extracts the round, and then it ejects the round. Gatling gun is essentially 6 weapons, just as I showed here, arranged in a cluster. And what happens is, as that cluster revolves, a cam in an outer cylinder moves the bolt back and forth to insert the rounds, lock the rounds, fire each cartridge, and then extract and eject the rounds. That is essentially the design of the Gatling gun.
In 1862, Gatling gave the first public demonstration of his gun in Indianapolis. The reaction was overwhelmingly enthusiastic. Confident and assured, Gatling tried to interest the United States government into buying the weapon. He traveled to Washington with his prototype, but his reception was lukewarm. The official reaction? Gatling's gun was too new, too radical.
The Chief of Ordnance in particular did not like the Gatling gun. His problem was that he had to provide something like 196 different calibers of ammunition to the Union Army. The problem being there was that every militia unit had its own weapon. So he had this tremendous ammunition problem. And when the Gatling gun came along, there was just another bunch of ammunition that he had to supply. The other factor was that it was huge. It was a big gun. It was as big as a piece of artillery. It took a lot of effort to get this thing around on the battlefield. And it just was one of these things of, it was newfangled, and it may or may not have worked, but he knew that the old single-shot weapon was going to work, and that's what he was going to go with.
Undaunted, Gatling made improvements to the gun. He devised a magazine holding up to 40 rounds of ammunition and increased the number of barrels from 6 to 10. The gun now weighed in excess of manufacturing facilities in Cincinnati and undertook numerous additional visits to Washington to interest the government. But the Chief of Army Ordnance, Brigadier James Ripley, still resisted.
Even though Abraham Lincoln was encouraging industry to come up with new weapons concepts, Ripley was the man who had to actually accept the weapon into the Army inventory. Let's not forget that Ripley had the Union Army still using percussion cartridges when metallic cartridges had been invented 17 years prior to the Civil War. In some regards, Ripley's decision may have made sense because he had to have the logistics in place to support any new weapons. Ripley also perhaps had another concern, and that is, how do you feed a weapon financially that can fire 800 shots per minute? That's a lot of ammunition, and he's the man who had to pay for it.
A tenacious man, Gatling did not give up trying to sell the weapon. The widespread introduction of self-contained all-metal cartridges had made the gun even more efficient. In 1863, Gatling gave a private demonstration to Major General Benjamin Butler of the Union Army. Butler was so impressed that he immediately bought 12 guns at a cost of $1,000 apiece, paying for them out of his own personal funds. It was a coup for Gatling. Butler did not introduce his guns into service right away, but at the Siege of Petersburg in 1864, one of the longest sustained operations of the war, lasting more than 9 months, he put them to good use in a defensive role.
Initially, these were heavy, cumbersome weapons. A Gatling was typically mounted on a carriage, had to be horse-drawn. A Gatling gun with its carriage would weigh 1,000 pounds. Army commanders tended to view Gatling guns as artillery pieces, cannon, more than machine guns. For that reason, they were primarily used as defensive weapons for fixed fortifications. In other words, if a commander had a site that he wished to defend, Gatling guns could be emplaced, kept in the same place, and used for defensive purposes. Due to their weight and lack of mobility, the Army tended not to use them in the offense.
By 1865, the conflict was rapidly drawing to a close. Introduction of the Gatling had come too late for it to have any significant impact on the outcome of the war. However, other nations were taking notice of Gatling's invention. Soon, the world would be buying his gun, and the face of war would change forever. Following the turbulent years of the Civil War, Richard Gatling continued to champion his gun. He entered into a manufacturing agreement with the Colt Firearms Company of Hartford, Connecticut, a relationship that would be enormously successful, spanning the next 4 decades. In 1866, the United States government changed its attitude towards the Gatling gun and ordered 50 units. Over the next 20 years, the Gatlings were used with limited success during the so-called Indian Wars. Oddly, its greatest impact may have been on the one occasion when it was not deployed. Colonel George Custer and his 7th Cavalry were equipped with 4 of the guns. In 1876, at the Battle of Little Bighorn, Custer made a fateful decision. He left the heavy Gatlings behind at his base camp. Custer's army, of course, was annihilated. The Gatling guns may have saved them, a fact that other military powers had already discovered. As early as 1871, a Russian delegation had tested the weapon. They were deeply impressed by its performance and eventually ordered 20 guns for the Imperial Army. But the Russians were cautious negotiators. They wanted the project to be personally overseen by one of their own representatives, General Gorlov.
And it soon became obvious to Dr. Gatling that Gorlov had more in mind than simply assuring that his weapons were assembled correctly and built to the exacting quality standards of the day. Gorlov was obviously interested in learning how to manufacture these things so he could set up a manufacturing facility in Russia to provide Russia with its own Gatling guns.
Faced with the difficult challenge of knowing that the Russians would simply find a way to copy and build the gun themselves if he refused to sell it to them, Gatling decided to chance his luck. He agreed to sell, on condition that they bought at least 100 units.
The Russians balked at that initially, and then Gatling said, what we'll do is, as part of our consideration for a larger purchase order of 100 Gatling guns, we will grant you the rights to manufacture Gatling guns in Russia. Colonel Gorlov looked at Gatling, Gatling looked at Colonel Gorlov. They both realized they had outwitted each other, and they said, agreed. And that's how Gatlings came to Russia. When they were manufactured in Russia, instead of calling the weapons Gatling guns, they became known as Gorlov guns.
Eventually, the Colt factory was able to offer the Gatling gun in a bewildering array of variants, with different mountings, magazines, and number of barrels. The British were next to test the weapon. They were so taken with it that they promptly ordered a quantity for the Army and the Royal Navy. The Gatling gun would now become a potent tool in the process of imperialism and colonization, particularly on the continent of Africa. There, it was used to subdue tribes and entire native populations in all parts of the continent. One campaign was against the Ashantis of West Africa in 1873.
The British actually arranged a firepower demonstration to show these poor fellows what they'd be up against if they chose to fight. And when Britain fired one of their Gatling guns, one of the natives was so terrified and so recognized the futility of attempting to oppose the British Army, he actually committed suicide just from seeing the gun fired.
Campaigns were also waged against the Dervishes of North Africa and the Hereros of Southwest Africa. But the most bitter series of battles were fought in 1879 against the Zulus in what is now South Africa.
The Zulu War was one of the most interesting colonial campaigns